In this great country of ours, we now live in a very unique point of history, many of which said would never come again. America has rediscovered the joys of traveling by rail. Amtrak can't even so much as find seats for passengers booking trains, causing congestion and basically making stations that were once, for the longest period in time, largely deserted structures with very few exceptions, mainly being that of commuter lines, suddenly bustling with activity, with passengers traveling from various different locations around the country, and again falling in love with that wonderful magic of riding on a train and watching the scenery go by. Not having to worry about driving, not having to worry about paying gas bills, and not having to worry about accidents, traffic jams, fuel bills, and so on. Many of those from more recent generations might wonder why Amtrak doesn't have enough seats for its passenger trains, and why the attitude toward trains was so negative. To understand this, we need to look at the history of rail travel in America, a specific section I call the Dark Ages, where railroads in general, not just in terms of passenger transportation, but in terms of hauling freight, were being viewed by the general American public as unnecessary, out of date, and otherwise completely and totally useless. One might ask how these short-sighted statements could be justified, and that answer is what I aim to give in this particular video. As a child, when I first fell in love with trains, I always asked my parents as to why more people didn't ride them. The response this question usually elicited was that the method of traveling by train was simply dying off, and in the future, passenger transportation by rail would not exist in any way, shape, or form, with the exception, of course, of trolley lines, subway lines, commuter lines, and so on. What a long and hard fall from grace rail transportation had suffered. As way back in the late 1800s, the train was really the only way to get anywhere in the United States, practically. The first transcontinental railroad was finally completed in 1869 with the driving of a gold and silver spite at Promontory, Utah, between the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. Back then, the only way to travel around the country was to utilize steamboats across inland waterways or the infamous stagecoach around rough and unpaved roads. In these earlier days of our country's existence, it was much more practical to, for example, travel from Maine to Florida via a ship going along the coast than it was to actually travel overland, because overland transportation was just so terrible. However, the railroads would change all of this. While initially the runs were kind of rough and derailments were common, new technology would make trains safer, faster, more reliable, and eventually the way to get around the country. And get around the country people did. Back in these days, it wasn't just about traveling for business or personal needs, etc. It was traveling for entertainment and just plain fun. Why? This is an era, we have to remember, which we didn't have the internet, let alone TV or radio. If one wanted to do something, one was left with either A, reading a book, or B, going outside and socializing with someone, or visiting friends. The idea of traveling was a new way of actually spending time, seeing the sights of the country, if you will. Quite challenging at first, this would become something very easy to do as time went on. The railroads would effectively give traveling a shot in the arm, not just providing connections from one coast to the other, but letting those passengers who, for example, wanted to travel to Europe have a connection to a port on either coast. Thus, the European trip became a common thing more wealthier Americans would undertake, mainly for the enjoyment of seeing new cultures and enjoying different countries. As things like sightseeing, while quite a new concept at this time, were becoming the thing to do, especially for more wealthy Americans. This increased transportation of not just passengers but goods as well began to help boost the American economy drastically. While in the past cargoes had to be limited to what could fit on a flat car or in a boxcar, and could not be perishable, this is to say these cargoes could not require refrigeration to avoid spoiling, as there simply was no way of doing this. With innovations such as the early refrigerated boxcars cooled by ice, introduced somewhere just after the Civil War, and more unique inventions such as the first tank car, which was introduced by the Hatch Empire Transportation Company back in 1860, allowing for the first time in the U.S. for the transportation of liquids and chemicals via rail in bulk. These new innovations, allowing for cargoes to be transported that would have been unheard of in the past, opened up entirely new businesses for the railroads in general, and also improved the life of the people living around the railroads and or an accessible range of the railroads, as they could now get goods that would not have been possible for them to receive in the past. All of this, plus a noticeable increase in consumer spending, caused the economy in the United States to boom like never before. This caused a sudden new class of people to emerge in the United States society, known as the middle class. Now, admittedly, in this day and age, this particular class of American society needs no introduction. Back in those days, it was quite revolutionary. Here was a class of people who were richer than poor people, but not as rich people. They could afford moderate luxuries, such as nicely made furniture from imported hardwoods, or fine linens brought from other countries, maybe not the highest quality again, but much better than what was available domestically. All of these items again largely being shipped to their destinations by the railroad from the factories. And yes, this new growing class of people could also afford to travel, and travel they did from east to west, west to east, north to south, and south to north, and even across the ocean, all made possible by transportation by railroad at least at some point in their journeys. With this increase in demand for transportation, the railroads responded by upgrading their equipment and upgrading and installing amenities unheard of before on the various different trains they operated across the country as well as up and down the coasts. By the early 1800s, one could actually get their hair cut on a train as well as have a full meal in a dining car, unlike before where the train would have had to have stopped at a restaurant, as well as enjoy a night in a very comfortable sleeping accommodation. Companies such as the Pullman Palace Car Company, who pioneered sleeping cars, continued to dream up new and innovative ways to make passengers comfortable on their long cross-country trips, making getting there part of the fun, if not half the fun. The early teens considered to see new enhancements, including more powerful locomotives that could now heat their trains with their own steam heat. Not to mention noticeably speed up train travel in general, making it much more practical to travel across the country, reducing the travel time, for example, of a cross-country train trip from weeks to days. There was also a new four-wheeled contraption that initially had been dismissed as a plaything for the rich, but was beginning to really gain traction, if you will, pardon the joke, and that was the automobile. However, the extreme crudity of the quality of roads that the United States possessed at that time, in addition to the fact that cars were still very expensive at this point in time, prevented the car from being utilized for long trips. Effectively, the car was something you used to get to the train to make your trip. This would, however, change in later years. More on this later. The teens would briefly bring a halt to this while World War I ran its course. After the war ended, and the teens ran into the 20s, the United States economy ignited, with more people traveling than ever before. In addition to new upgrades and accommodations on the trains, there were also new cargoes being hauled, made possible by new innovative freight cars that were introduced to haul these cargoes, such as refrigerated box cars that now utilized mechanical refrigeration units not relying on ice. This allowed for more perishable goods to be hauled across the country. Unfortunately, as it is very well known now, the 20s boom wouldn't last, and by the 1930s the Great Depression was set off. The sudden kick to the stomach that was the Great Depression effectively took some railroads out, and causing others to run into severe financial problems. Many businesses were gone, and many millionaires, at least they were before the whole Depression era kicked in, now were reduced to selling apples on the street corner and living in modest accommodations such as tenements or slums, or even worse, were completely homeless. Railroads clearly needed to do something, as they could not simply abandon passenger service. This was mainly due to government regulations/requirements. Luckily, there was a man of the hour with the answer. Ralph Budd, the chairman of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, who came up with the concept of utilizing lightweight streamlined cars. He was introduced into the lightweight stainless steel car concept by who would turn out to be a distant relative, Ed Budd, and the owner of the Budd Car Company. The new streamlined lightweight cars would eventually be turned into a small train referred to as the Zephyr, named for the god of the western wind. This unique train, which featured cars that were semi-permanently coupled together, including its locomotive, which doubled as a passenger car, would not be steam-propelled as was the technology of the day. Instead, it would be diesel-powered by an engine from the Winton Company, which would eventually become part of GM. The end result of all these innovations was one of the world's first streamliners, but not the first. That honor belongs to a Union Pacific train referred to as the M10,000, with a similar concept, except that particular train was made with thin aluminum attached to a steel frame and was more prone to corrosion. Effectively, the railroad industry in terms of passenger travel had been completely reborn, as this streamlined sector, which again was referred to as the Zephyr, could reach speeds in excess of 150 miles per hour on tests, and its inaugural run actually did so, making the run between Denver and Chicago in under 5 hours. This whole event was admittedly a publicity stunt aimed at attracting new passengers to trail travel, requiring switches to actually be welded into place, for example, to make it possible and to have all the traffic diverted off the main line, something that could not be done on a consistent basis, at least not for a train going this quickly because of all the ground it was covering this rapidly. In addition to everything else, the high speeds would put a huge amount of strain on the tracks, making operating a train set at this speed even less practical, as this would drastically increase the amount of maintenance the tracks required. That said, however, it was successful, and many more people began to think about traveling by train once again. With the Depression slowly but surely recovering and the new streamlined train's new approach to everything, the American economy began to slowly but surely come out of the Depression. Streamlining itself became sort of the marketing word to bring the country out of the Depression, if you will. It indicated light, efficient, new, modern, and, well, just plain good, if you will. And it wasn't just the trains that were being streamlined. Household appliances, for example, such as toasters, ovens, refrigerators, all got the streamlined treatment. Why? Because it looked cool and because it implied modernism. This new unique design / Art Deco look would begin to inspire a whole new look for homes in general called mid-century modern. Cars would initially get a streamlined look, but this wouldn't last very long, as it apparently was too much for customers to expect their cars to look like something out of a sci-fi film. Of course, this would change in later years, and streamlining would become all the rage for car designs. All seemed to be well in the United States until the beginning of World War II, with the attacks on Pearl Harbor taking place in 1941, the war having strictly been localized to Europe since 1939. World War II would effectively throw a lifeline to the much-needing railroads who were still recovering from the Depression at that time, as cars were effectively put up on blocks due to lack of parts and rationed rubber and gas, etc. The United States war machine would ignite, utilizing the railroads to transport goods for the war effort, including weapons, as well as soldiers to fight in the war to either coast, to be shipped off via ship to the various different battlefields around the world. The real effect the war would have on the railroads would be quite shocking, and not in the way one would think. As with the conclusion of the war in 1946, the United States government suddenly had plenty of extra aircraft that it had no need for or use for. And so, recognizing that storing the equipment would be a folly, as it would cost far too much, they were effectively fire-sailed. This and special programs put aside to help returning GIs start businesses allowed for many small airlines to crop up out of nowhere, hauling passengers and freight. Now, admittedly, these airlines were quite crude for the time. Aircraft that were considered revolutionary for this time, such as the DC-3, for example, could not fly above most weather systems, making flying a rather bumpy and treacherous affair for the time being, but this would change with the interest in going skyward. Flying, you see, was becoming a new buzzword, and in about 10 years, much like the streamliners had of previous generation before, and travel by train had at the turn of the century, getting to your destination much quicker and being much high class doing it, especially in 1958 with the introduction of the first successful American jetliner, the 707, all would combine together to make the airlines the main way of getting around the country. Who wanted to take the old-fashioned slow train when you can get there quicker, and of course do it in high class? And now you could do it for much cheaper. With so many airlines around, prices began to drop per ticket, and the airline industry slowly but surely began to get off the ground. It would be temporarily held back by government regulations, but these would eventually be phased out in later years. More on this later. There was also the fact that the airlines didn't actually have to own any land to actually travel through because they didn't utilize it. They flew through the air. And their airports were usually provided to them by the federal or by local state governments and effectively funded and built for them. All the companies required was a hangar to store their equipment, and they were basically off the ground. Sorry. Then there was the interstate highway system, which began construction with a guaranteed loan pact passed by the Eisenhower administration known as the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956. Once this particular highway system was put in, the United States suddenly had a whole road system network available to its citizens for no cost at all. It could effectively take them anywhere they wanted to go, within the continental United States, most notably at their own discretion, pace, and leisure. All one had to do was gas the car, hop in, and or put the family in, and they could go anywhere they wanted to. And again, it must be emphasized, for not much money, with gas being as little as 10 cents a gallon. In addition, trucking companies would start up and could utilize the highway system depending upon what cargoes they were hauling to get from point A to point B, as long again as said highway was allowing commercial traffic. All of this again as long as it made the requirements as provided at no expense to the trucking companies as well as the civilian cars, and began to put a huge strain on railroads, who incidentally not only were required to keep their equipment in good maintained condition for safety reasons obviously, but also were required to maintain their tracks and support facilities such as roundhouses, car shops, etc., and pay taxes on all of it, putting the railroads at a huge disadvantage against these two methods of transportation. In addition to initially having cost savings thanks to gas being as little as 1 dime a gallon, and of course insurance rates being extremely low, there was the intoxicating charm of jumping in one's car and driving across the country just for the sake of getting the drive and to really see what was around them. Such things could be done with the trains, but here, one was free to be in charge of their own destiny, make the stops they wanted to make and see the sights they wanted to see, and not subject to a railroad's timetable. This was true freedom, but it came with a responsibility that would eventually cause issues way down the line. More on this later. Then, of course, there was the new generation of airliners propelled by jets known as the Jet Age. Once this era started, it really turned things on its end. Now one could travel across the country in hours rather than days. This would also bring destinations in range for much shorter trips, not requiring the long time to get back and forth between the destination in order to enjoy one's vacation. While many could be forgiven for thinking that the airlines would simply be the way of getting around in the country from that point on, and that would be the end, with the exception of some basic train service and perhaps some bus service provided by companies like Greyhound, several factors would come into play to make this not the case and actually put the airlines back on the back burner. More on this later. Then there was the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC for short. This organization was set up to keep the railroads in line, essentially to deal with the robber barons that ran railroads back in the day, although not all railroad owners, it should be noted, were robber barons. There were quite a few of them, and railroads tended to operate as monopolies in some areas. Others were largely set up as almost Ponzi schemes, being built for the sake of attracting investors before the main owners of the company would disappear, leaving who would unfortunately decide to invest in said railroad, which usually had duplicated track and no hope of actually surviving, to basically shoulder the cost of keeping the railroad afloat and or pay the price if the company was to shut down or go bankrupt. All that said, by this point their regulations seemed more and more politically motivated, as all of the staff that made these regulations up on the ICC were political appointees. They were not elected officials. This would make this group at least somewhat submissive to the current president and administration in charge of the country at the time, with politicians having access to grind with companies, or worse, being biased toward car companies over the railroads or airlines in exchange for offers of political clout and or donations to one's political campaign, etc. There was also a huge shift in the way labor was paid for railroads. Admittedly, wages before this point were kept extremely low. However, with the unionization, as well as special regulations being added onto the railroads, and of course the before-mentioned ICC, this began to change. More realistic time frames were put for employees to work, and better benefits were granted. This unfortunately had an adverse effect on railroads, as they suddenly weren't able to make the same profits overhauling the same goods as they did before, if at all. This is particularly going to become a problem for passenger service, which was already having a major toll taken upon it by all the previously mentioned issues. More on this later. All of this led up to the whole environment in which railroads were re-emerged after World War II being completely different than what it was before the war had begun, and in addition, completely different from the environment it was imagined to be after the war was complete. Gone were the dreams of double-decker streamliners with as many as 50 cars in length, with incredible if not completely impractical amenities such as fully equipped swimming pools and gyms, replaced with the reality of tighter profit margins, less ridership, and overall a less positive opinion by the American public. The grandiose plans of double-decker streamliners with 50-plus cars and all sorts of crazy amenities were replaced by heavily worn-out equipment that was deliberately being under-maintained to maintain a profit margin. but mostly by this point to stem the losses, so they weren't quite as bad as they could be, leading to coaches that often leaked water when it rained, and were worse for wear, especially in their interiors, and railroads that were doing whatever they could to get out of the passenger business. A good example was the Southern Pacific, who by the late 60s would completely discontinue dining car service on all of its trains, and while sleeping car service was available, the company would constantly market it as being full when passengers tried to book it. This would give the company evidence to the ICC that it wasn't selling its passenger accommodations, and it had valid reasons to be let out of its passenger transportation requirements. Images such as these, with passenger trains looking more and more worn out and less glamorous, to put it mildly, did not exactly help the situation for passenger companies either, and helped to reinforce this image that passenger trains were simply dying off and not necessary anymore. Now, while many railroad companies took this route toward passenger service, it wasn't the case for all companies across the United States, it should be noted. Companies like the Santa Fe, who considered their passenger service a calling card for their freight service, kept their equipment maintained to a high level of standard, and even ordered newer diesel locomotives to propel their passenger trains by this point in the late 60s, something no company was doing at that time, to ensure passengers traveling on their Streamliners got the best experience possible, as these passengers again could be future customers if they had a pleasant experience. This flawed logic was also being applied to freight trains. Many people believe that since the cargo was being delivered to their stores, for example, more and more by trucks, that the trucks simply haul the cargo straight from its original originating point, be it a farm for produce, or be it a factory for a television set. Very ignorant of the fact that even if the truck did in fact transport everything from the factory to the actual store in which the person now purchased said item, piece of produce, etc., most likely, at some point in this particular product's life, be it food or electronics, the railroads in some way had possessed and transported that item to get it to where it was. Politicians at the time leaned into this particular image that railroads were again unnecessary and not required. After all, a person could simply drive across the country if they wanted to, or take a plane or even one of the buses. And goods, of course, would be shipped by trucks. Who needed the railroads? This, however, couldn't be more inaccurate. Railroads were still playing a very critical role in transporting goods even at their lowest point. Without the railroads, the American economy would grind to a halt. But yet again, this is a situation in which the public opinion / perception of what was taking place did not line up with the reality of the situation. The end result, a growing public consensus, was that railroads were simply not necessary and we could survive without them. Needless to say, this was extremely flawed logic. One of the main flaws of this logic was exposed during the 1974 United States oil crisis, when OPEC cut off the spigot, essentially reducing the supply of oil to the United States drastically, driving oil prices up and causing fuel to be rationed for the first time since World War II. Suddenly, the oversized gas guzzlers didn't have the ability to drive down the highways, and even the economy cars were struggling to find ways of filling their tanks. Couple this with a sharp increase in accidents, rising insurance costs, as well as ever-increasing and more monotonous traffic jams, traveling by car became less and less of a joyride, if you will, and more of a pain in the neck. Especially considering the motorist who once was able to simply get aboard a train and simply enjoy the scenery was now responsible for dealing with all the previously mentioned issues. And if you think that sounded bad, the airlines were in a whole other world of hurt, because of the fact that airliners tend to consume much more fuel than the average gas-guzzling automobile. The end result, flying became impractical as well due to higher prices, canceled flights due to lack of fuel, and overall just unpleasantness. Then there was the fact that the flying infrastructure around the United States was now becoming overburdened. Flying had become cheaper around this period in time, and almost anyone could afford to fly. This also meant that the infrastructure was being attacked like never before, with more and more people flying on a system that was not meant for the population it was shifting around. While definite attempts were made to correct the situation, such as introducing larger planes and improving airports and/or building new airports and larger airports, or adding secondary airports to big cities, this still did not handle the situation completely. Bottom line, something had to change. With all this in mind, the American population began to look at trains as a serious contender for transportation, and why not? As a whole new definition of high-speed transportation had been born about 10 years earlier in Japan, called the Shinkansen. This high-speed train had a maximum speed of 136 miles per hour and cut the trip time between Osaka and Tokyo down to about 4 hours. From the original 6 it used to take via a more conventional, slower train. The end result of this, excitingly enough, brought Osaka within commuting distance of Tokyo. A huge revolution in itself, which Americans began to feel, let's say, envious of and wanted their own version of. And in response to this, the Johnson administration would ratify an act called the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act and incorporate it into their Great Society Act. While it is true that the Great Society Act definitely had some laudable goals that could definitely be applauded if they were accomplished, one must admit that this was, at least to a certain extent, designed to distract the American public from the situation going on in Vietnam, which had no clear victory conditions and was causing many young Americans to be drafted into the armed forces, many of which would die. While the initial goal of the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act was to get high-speed transportation on the Northeast Corridor and then eventually spread it nationwide, as with many projects that could be considered political vanity projects, the goals themselves began to get slowly but surely whittled away on by the Johnson administration. The main issue being is that it was very difficult to achieve these high speeds on infrastructure that just couldn't handle it. The Northeast Corridor, still an infrastructure that had not been updated and was again designed and built during the early 1900s, making high-speed ground transportation on this line difficult. And unfortunately, this act did not make any meaningful changes in the actual infrastructure that was going to support these high-speed trains, and effectively was doomed to fail from the start. And slowly but surely, as with any government vanity project, if you will, the goalposts got continuously moved for this act to the point where it accomplished very little of anything. While the Metroliners were eventually introduced on August 26 of 1969, their top speed wasn't much better than what was there before. With the then speed demons of the Northeast Corridor, the GG1 Electrics, making 90 miles per hour, the service speed of the Metroliners was 100 miles per hour. Amtrak, who would later inherit these train sets, would later find they could in fact make the actual trip to Washington, D.C. within 3 hours if they utilized a reduced stop schedule, eventually finding ways of getting the GG1s to make 100 miles per hour, and eventually upgrading to a Swedish-designed locomotive called the AEM-7 that would make 120 miles per hour. While this certainly made the Northeast Corridor much more appetizing and at this point drastically improved travel on that particular part of Amtrak, the rest of the rail service would lag behind. It would take another 30 or 40 years for this to really kick in. Then in 1999, the American Flyer project, soon to be renamed Acela, was introduced. This particular project showed much promise, as it not only planned to introduce new trains, known as the Acela train sets, that were capable of reaching 150 miles per hour, it also planned to upgrade some parts of the infrastructure of the Northeast Corridor. The most notable of these was the North End Electrification Project, which started around the same time, which would actually electrify the part of the Northeast Corridor between Boston and New Haven, allowing trains to run directly through to Boston without having to change locomotives to diesel power. This in itself really helped out the time traveled by the trains, ironically enough, more than the actual speeds of the trains. The 150 miles per hour was largely a marketing campaign, as only a few brief sections could handle it. In reality and practice, these 150 mile per hour brief sections really have no effect on train travel on the Northeast Corridor to this day, as even a slight delay can often destroy and or mitigate their effect. Again, and ironically enough, the biggest time saver on the Boston section of the Northeast Corridor, and indeed the whole part of the Northeast Corridor for quite some time until more recent times, was the fact that the North End Electrification Project eliminated the need to change the diesel engines at Connecticut for the run to Boston. In more recent times, as the Acela Liberty sets finally enter service, holding about 160 miles per hour as their top speed and capable of going faster where conditions allow, and the hopes that further upgrades will continue on the Northeast Corridor, it is hoped that the travel time will be further reduced along this section of American railroading, at least make it something resembling the higher speed rail transportation which European and Asian countries enjoy to this day. Now, while the obvious deficiencies increasingly coming up on road travel as well as airline travel, etc., certainly had an effect on the changing behavior of American consumers, What it comes down to is it had to get into the hearts and minds of people that there are other ways to get around, and that would take a new generation. Enter the Millennials, Generation Yers, etc. This new generation was less and less interested in having to drive from point A to point B, and not just for practical reasons such as higher insurance rates and fuel rates. With the new population that likes to stay connected more than it likes to drive cars, and social networking becoming more and more important, plus with the again mentioned higher fuel costs, insurance costs, and so on, makes cars and travel by car far less practical for this new generation. And so the responsible decision is to basically have someone drive you someplace, and what better way than to use the train for moderate to long trips. With bus travel, ironically enough, developing a highly infamous reputation for worn-out equipment and horrific customer service. Not to mention a clientele that rode these buses increasingly becoming known for being rough around the edges, to put it mildly, having been banned from flying and other such methods of transportation in the United States. One of the reasons why trains in general began to pick up in popularity. The other main being is that traffic on trains tends to be much lower than that on the highways, with trains not being subject to the annoying and very much common traffic jams that occur more and more in the United States. With these factors becoming increasingly noticeable, Amtrak itself suddenly began to notice in the late teens a steady increase in passengers taking the train. This, coupled with the growing realization by politicians and state officials alike that it is highly unrealistic for operations like Amtrak to exist without state subsidies, let alone be self-sufficient. The end result with more funding, more upgrades to track, better equipment on the horizon as well as currently in service, and of course the changing tastes of travelers alike, train travel has begun to slowly but surely explode. In fact, in 2024, Amtrak announced that yet again it had broken its revenue record, with ridership reaching 32.8 million trips taken by consumers by train, an all-time record for the company. With all this in mind, the company is currently doing whatever it can to secure more trains to travel its current network. And while the funding that has been provided is a great first step, more changes still need to be made. For example, Amtrak, because of the way it assumed passenger service in 1971 when it took over the nation's rail passenger travel, still needs to pay rent to other railroads to utilize their tracks. This often puts Amtrak trains in the lurch, specifically with the freight railroad companies obviously not wanting to give passenger trains priority, as this would delay their freight trains. Freight companies like Norfolk Southern, for example, have been given the infamous F rating for their ability to keep Amtrak trains on time, as they often prioritize their freight trains over the Amtrak service, again, as admittedly freight trains are the main reason these companies exist, and they have no incentive to keep Amtrak trains on time, as they really don't face much in the way of consequences for not doing so. This results in consistent and very annoying delays for Amtrak riders who do not travel on trains that do not traverse tracks that Amtrak owns, such as the Northeast Corridor. This specific issue continues to cause Amtrak its main issues in terms of maintaining and upgrading its service and or adding more trains to its service. Until issues like this, and of course the chronic funding issues the company has suffered since its inception, are resolved, Amtrak will continue to struggle to maintain a reliable rail network for passenger transport across the continental United States. Now, while in the past this could have been considered a pipe dream to have all of this magically work itself out, it's beginning to look more and more likely that this will happen, although it still will take great effort from private companies, not just Amtrak, mind you, as well as in general better funding for Amtrak. Keep in mind that most European countries, for example, spend more than double what the United States does in terms of subsidies on its rail network to maintain their rail networks. Bottom line, while all this will take quite a bit of effort, there's the best chance yet that this will all come to fruition and Amtrak will become a very viable option to travel around the United States, as this country continues to leave the dark age of railroading in its wake. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please like and subscribe. And as always, keep the metal side down.